Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Trevor Shell. I'd like to welcome you all to the second of four weekly webinars of our 26th annual webinar series, which is focused on recognition and prevention of musculoskeletal disorders. OHCOW's RSI Day webinar series has become the world's largest ergonomic-focused webinar of its kind. This year, halfway into our weekly event, we have surpassed last year's total of unique registrants from various countries. To date, we have registrants from across 61 different countries, up from 7 from last year. Now, today's session is entitled Reality Check, Hazard Mitigation. We're going to have two presentations for you today. Our first presentation is going to be presented by André Gauvin, one of OHCOW's occupational hygienists, who will be speaking on a new toolkit OHCOW's created for heat stress. A second presentation today will be brought to us by our ergonomists Daryl Stevenson and Andrew Flanagan on ergonomics and manual materials handling, enhancing safety and efficiency. Now, before we actually begin, I also want to take a moment to thank you all for joining us again for today's session and to wish everybody with us a very happy Valentine's Day. Now, I'd like to introduce André Gauvin, who's going to be speaking about OHCOW's new heat stress toolkit.
Hey, well, thanks, Trevor. Again, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is André Gauvin. I'm an occupational hygienist with the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers. I'm based out of Sudbury, Ontario. So it's actually a very cold day today here. We're hitting some -20s here in Sudbury. So talking about heat stress, we're going to switch gears here, going the other way. So talk about our current situation first. So, we've had a proposed regulation from the Ministry of Labor. We're still waiting on that. It seems like our position's currently on hold with the election scheduled at the end of February. So once that's done, it might be tabled again. I know it was mentioned that they think that the regulations we have in place may be sufficient. And with the new toolkit that we have, if they follow that, it should be fine. Yes, that may be true. However, regulations often put a little more pressure on employers to do the right thing. So we're still kind of pushing for regulation, but we'll see what happens there. There's obviously new challenges with climate change, just bringing awareness to everybody. Wildfire smokes, there's a ton of wildfires going on every summer. And there's also, temporary foreign workers who are exposed at not only outdoors, but even in their bunkhouses. So we did a study on that to see what's been happening, and some of these workers are actually exposed. They're more exposed to heat stress when they're off of work than they are at work. So there's those issues as well. We have about 15 to 20 years experience with the OHCOW tool, which is just a Humidex plan. So we built those about 20 years ago, and they've been in place where people have been using them for at least 15 years now. And then we had an opportunity with the MOL to have some funding to update the tools. So that's kind of what we did. So based on the evaluations that we've had from other HSAs and unions, employers who have used the tools, we've been able to make some changes to go along with that. So the Ontario Climate Change Report. So when you look at this report here, it says that we have an average of about 9 days above 30 degrees Celsius every year. Well, just looking at 3 of our major cities in Ontario. So you look at Toronto, Ottawa, and Windsor. In the last 3 years or 3 summers, we've had more than 9 days. So Windsor, you had 25 in 2022. 11 in 2023, and 2024 was a pretty hot summer in Windsor with 26 days above 30 degrees Celsius. And then Toronto, it's on a decline. And Ottawa is pretty consistent. That's 16 to 14 days. So this is the old heat stress awareness guide. So we updated it to the heat stress toolkit. And when you're looking at the awareness guide, it kind of turned into the prevention tools and strategies. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But we do have 3 guides. So we have the awareness guide, which is kind of like an encyclopedia about heat stress, kind of gives you everything about it. And we're going to go through a little bit of that today. The heat stress prevention tools and strategies. And then we have the physiological monitoring guide as well. And we have some links for the toolkit. They're going to be in the chat. Trevor's going to do that for us. If you feel free to click on those and check them out. There's also a bunch of infographics that you can take a look at, and posters and things that you can just post on your bulletin board to give awareness to your workers. So when we're looking at this, at creating this toolkit, we were kind of thinking on who we're trying to reach and what we want them to know or to do, not just know. So the audience was really, heat stress exposed workers is a big one. Health and safety reps, supervisors, even heat stress program managers and professionals and senior management. You kind of want everyone to be involved in the program. And since the project was originally funded by unions and the prevention partners, which used to be the OHCOW, we thought it was important to try and re-engage everyone. So we had the Ontario Health and Safety System partners involved, the Ministry of Labor, unions, and the OFL as well, help us develop the toolkit. So in the winter months, obviously, our body is trying to conserve heat, but over the hotter months, your body's thermostat needs to change from heating to cooling. So what's that called? It's called thermoregulation. So despite variations in temperature, humans can maintain a constant body temperature by balancing heat gain with heat loss. So we as humans can tolerate a decline in core temperature of about 10 degrees Celsius on a decline, but only an increase of about 5 degrees Celsius before your system starts to shut down. So what happens when your body starts to heat up? So on a regular day, this is kind of what your arteries and capillaries look like. And this is kind of what your body profile would look like. But this is kind of on a regular day inside here, obviously not in the cold. In the cold, you would constrict even more to try and keep your core temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. So when it starts to heat up, or you start to exercise even, all of your arteries start to get bigger. This is called vasodilation. So most of your capillaries, and it pushes the heat towards extremities so that you can dissipate that heat. And then your body profile would look something like the one on the left here, where you have 37 degrees pushing out at all extremities to try and dissipate that heat. And this is kind of the process of thermoregulation to cool your body. So how do we feel when you're exposed to heat? So what kind of symptoms do you experience? Typically, you'd start with some general fatigue. So transient heat fatigue is called. Some sluggish, you'll feel sluggish when you're working, just tiredness. And a lot of times all you need is a little bit of fluid replacement and rest, and you'll be okay. And a little bit of time away from the heat. And then you also have heat rashes. So heat rashes is an irritation of the skin caused by excessive heat and sweating. It really develops because of plugged sweat glands. So a lot of times it happens when you're working in a dirtier environment. So your sweat glands will get clogged, and it kind of looks like little pimples on your skin. And then you'll have some redness, and it'll be itchy, and it'll be a bumpy rash that's pretty itchy. One of the things you can do to mitigate this is, or not to mitigate, but to avoid this is just, if you do feel that you're working in the dirt and stuff, it just kind of putting some cool water on your skin to kind of rinse it off. Typically it'll take the rash away. Heat syncope. So this is basically fainting. And it's usually the first signs of heat stress, typically in the earlier season of heat stress. So before your circulation system has adapted to the heat. So a lot of times this will happen, after, like if you're working in the heat and you sat down to have your lunch or something like that, and now most of your blood is going to your stomach to try and digest your food, and then you get up and you start working right away in the hot sun, you might have some fainting symptoms or dizziness, nausea, things like that, and you'll feel faint. And some people, they pass out right away, and then they're up in 2-3 seconds. It's just that lack of blood flow going to your brain because your body is not acclimatized to that at the moment. So it's usually in the earlier parts of the season. If that does happen, you want to place the victim in a cool location, a prone position. If they're conscious, you give them fluids, and it's the same treatment as if you've been in shock, kind of thing. You can also have some heat cramps, so that's cramping of the legs, arms, usually the muscles that are being used. And that's usually because you don't have enough electrolytes in your body. So as you're sweating, especially in your earlier season again, you're not acclimatized, your body's not used to that. So you're sweating a lot of the electrolytes out. As you work in this environment more and more, your body seems to be more efficient, and it keeps the electrolytes in while sweating more water. So, drinking electrolyte replacing fluids like Gatorade, quenchers, Powerade, things like that will help replenish your electrolytes. So heat exhaustion would be the next symptom, right? A little more serious. You're getting into nausea, dizziness, weakness, headache, blurred vision, profuse sweating, cold, wet, clammy skin, unconsciousness, coma, or death. Usually unconsciousness, coma, or death is more in the heat stroke stage, but we put it here in heat exhaustion because it can switch from heat exhaustion to heat stroke very quickly. So it's important to recognize these symptoms. So again, the first aid for this, if you do have a worker or something that's going through heat exhaustion, is to find a cool location and rest there. Place them in a prone position if they're unconscious, give them fluids if they're conscious, and seek medical help immediately, and transport them to the medical room if they might need, IV treatment to replenish their fluids and electrolytes. So which organ in the body is most susceptible to heat? Typically, I would ask this in person, but since we're on a webinar, I'll just put it out there. So that's the brain. You want to protect the brain at all costs, right? That's how you function. So you have your hypothalamus. This is basically your heat loss center. And this is what controls your heat loss mechanisms. But if they get too hot, basically your hypothalamus doesn't know what to do. Your brain doesn't know what to do anymore. So it just starts to go crazy, and it just says, okay, well, I'm shutting everything down. So the brain functions best at a temperature of about 37 degrees. And heat stress programs are designed to keep the body temperature below 38 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that is because at 40 degrees Celsius, the brain gives up on trying to cool the body. So your hypothalamus just says, well, I don't know what to do anymore. This is way too hot. I'm trying to tell you to cool down, but you're not doing it, or your body's giving you signs and symptoms to cool down, and it's not happening. You're not kind of following what I'm trying to tell you, so it just shuts down. And this is where you get into heat stroke. So you might have chills, restlessness, irritability, euphoria. I don't know if anybody has ever seen someone under heat stroke, but they're disoriented. They're kind of lost. They don't really know where they are. They have hot, dry skin, so they're not really sweating anymore. They can collapse, become unconscious, have convulsions, and even death. So immediate aggressive cooling is important in these cases, and using wet cloths, immersion into cold water, anything that'll be cooler than their skin is important. Just put that on them to try and cool them as quickly as possible, and transporting them to emergency medical facilities as soon as possible to try and get these people recovered. So it's important to watch out for each other. So a worker heading into heat stroke, they won't be able to realize what's happening anymore. Most of them are lost. Like I said, they're disoriented. They have no clue what's going on by that point. So you really got to watch out for them. And that's where the buddy system comes in. It's really important to have coworkers being able to recognize what's happening and intervene, and always working together in the heat. So without quick attention, a coworker may actually die from heat stroke. So there's also other health effects. So we have chronic long-term health effects. So chronic exposure to heat can result in long-term illness affecting the brain, heart, kidney, livers, and muscles, especially if you've had a pre-existing condition. It can also affect both male and female reproductive systems, making it harder to conceive. With chronic heat stress can disturb your sleep patterns and affect mental health. I don't know if any of you have this, if you don't have air conditioning in your house and you go to sleep in the summer months and you just can't sleep because it's really warm out. I used to have that when I was a kid. We didn't have air conditioning. We do now, thankfully, but definitely used to disturb my sleep. We've also found a study that with consecutive days of heat stress can lead to cumulative impact on the body. So without enough recovery time away from the heat, the strain can actually accumulate instead of actually allowing the body to adapt or acclimate to the heat. There's a buildup of strain which may result in causing more harm. And this is particularly in older adults, 55 plus is what the significance was in the study. So who's more susceptible to heat stress with all this, right? So which of your coworkers are you worried about most? So there are some predisposing factors. The risk factors are, very small body size. People are overweight, over the age of 40, and really over the age of 55 is even more sensitive. Previous heat illness, if you've had a previous heat illness, you're more susceptible to another heat illness. Heart disease, so obviously with your circulation being affected with heart disease, you might have a harder time with heat loss. High blood pressure, diabetes, inactivity, so people are inactive again. People who are physically active, so sooner or later, really, we're all at risk. So nobody can get away from heat stress. It's important to, make sure that we know the signs and symptoms and that we're watching out for everyone. So with all the vulnerabilities, who are the ones who typically get heat stroke? Well, typically it's the young physical males, and then the elderly sick. And the reason it's the young physically fit males is because they seem to be the ones that feel like they're invincible. So they push, right? Especially the ones who are athletes, they're trained to kind of push through pain and push through the signs and symptoms that you might be having. So in the workplace, you really got to watch for these people because sometimes they just don't stop. And if you look at these two here, these two athletes actually died from heat stroke. They're both professional athletes. They're training in the heat, and next thing you know, they died of heat stroke. And I just seen them chat there, soldiers as well, and that's a good point. Soldiers are also trained to push through the limits, so you got to watch out for each other. So there's also indirect health effects. So or indirect costs to heat stress. So you have reduced work performance, right? You're tired, fatigued workers, so they have a reduced accuracy and efficiency when they're trying to perform their work. You might have more accidents at work because they're tired and fatigued. They're more susceptible to accidents and injury. Reproductive problems, we talked about that. It can happen both male and females. It can also affect the fetus. So it's another thing. If you do have a pregnant woman in the workplace and she's working in the heat, it's something to watch out for. Probably best to not have her work in the heat. If you've had previous heart, lung disease, or kidney or circulatory problems, heat stress and added strain on your body, and it can precipitate to more serious and acute problems. And then poor morale. So anybody working under heat stress conditions are usually not happy. So it can aggravate a pre-existing morale, a labor relations problem as well. So heat loss. So how does your body lose heat, right? So there's 4 processes that contribute to heat loss. You have radiation, which is, you have all the heat going to your extremities to radiate the heat. This usually works together with convection. So as it radiates the heat, you have, some cool wind or something blowing by you, and it kind of just cools you off. And then you have conduction, which is, process of touching something colder, which will cool your body down in turn. And then evaporation. So evaporation is important. Also, evaporation sweat. As you sweat, the wind goes by, it'll evaporate it, and it cools your body down. So under exercise and heavy workload, evaporation is almost the only thing that is cooling you down. It's about 80% of your heat loss mechanisms is evaporation of sweat. So it's really important to stay hydrated. So what are the signs of hydration? So inadequate hydration, you'll see that you're urinating less often. You have excessive weight loss. You might have a strong odor to your urine, and the urine color is going to be pretty dark. And then if you are adequately hydrated, you'll have frequent urination. Your urine color will be light. It's not going to be clear completely. It'll be more like a light beer, and it'll be odorless. So what to drink if you're hydrated or if you're dehydrated? So electrolyte drinks are good, but they're not usually needed for our typical North American diet unless you're getting some heat cramps and it's early on in the season. So Gatorade is good. I would stay away from Prime because there's a massive amount of electrolytes in there. And there's also caffeine in them, and you want to stay away from that. Prime is, there's enough electrolytes in one of those to create imbalances in your body to cause other issues. So again, I'd stay away from that, especially if you have a salty diet already. Again, stay away from caffeinated, carbonated drinks. These and diet drinks and alcohol, these actually take water out of your body rather than keeping them in. So water is best, or juices, just to give you that glucose. And non-caffeinated sports drinks are also good. So juices will contain a little bit of that energy to restore your glucose and give your body, your cells, what it needs to be efficient. So how much should you be drinking? So it's about a cup every 20 minutes, even if you're not thirsty. So as soon as you are thirsty, it's usually too late. It usually means that you're dehydrated a little bit. So again, every 20 minutes, a cup or a full bottle every half hour to an hour max. So a 500 milliliter bottle of water every half hour is pretty good. So what factors can we measure for heat stress? So what are we measuring when we measure for heat stress? Well, we have the Humidex plan, so temperature and relative humidity, which we're going to go through. The ACGIH TLV, which they look at the wet bulb globe temperature, or the effective wet bulb globe temperature. And then you also have physiological monitoring. So that's, heart rate, skin temperature, core temperature. And this is usually involving a more complex heat stress program. You don't typically see this in a regular workplace. You might see it in, greenhouses or in underground workplaces where there's extreme heat, or even, where they're working at furnaces and things like that, where there is extreme heat and they can't, take the necessary breaks that they need because they have to be there. So then you would have physiological monitoring to see, okay, well, let's monitor them until the point where we have to take them away to give them that break, right? So the ACGIH heat strain or heat stress and strain TLV, this is basically the gold standard. So everything that we've done in this toolkit is based off of this. And the reason that we use it is because it's evidence-based, right? The ACGIH has been around for a long time. They have detailed literature summaries and an explanation of how the TLV works and instruction on how to properly apply it. It's considered minimal professional practice standards, and it's been used since 1974 and constantly updated. So we've had the last update for the heat stress TLV was in 2022, and that's what we based everything off of. So because the WBG or the ACGIH uses the WBGT, well, we need to know what it is, right? So the wet bulb globe thermometer, you have, or wet bulb globe temperature, you have three different thermometers here. So you have the normal thermometer or the dry bulb, which is that one there. Then you have the wet bulb thermometer, which measures humidity. And you have your globe temperature, which measures radiant heat. And that makes up the wet bulb globe temperature. So there are two different formulas. You have one for indoor or shaded environments, and then you have one for direct sunlight exposure, which includes the globe temperature, or the dry bulb, sorry. And then you would apply that measure to this screening criteria for the effective WBGT. The difference between the 2022 and the older TLV is that they actually stated it's for acclimatized and unacclimatized workers, where the old one didn't really state what it was for. There was just an action limit and then a TLV. So it's a little bit more, or a little bit easier to follow in that sense. But yeah, you would take the measurement and then you would apply it here. But again, you have to remember that it's a time weighted average, so you need to take multiple measures. So now we'll get into, so we kind of went through the heat stress awareness guide there a little bit of information. There's a lot more detail in the guide itself, so I'd encourage you to read that. But now we're getting into the prevention tools and strategies. So what we did with this guide is that we kind of split up the heat stress management program into 4 different levels, right? Something that's more simpler and more frequent, going to a more complex and less frequently used. So you have supported self-management. Let's go through it here. Supported self-management, which is knowledgeable workers who have demonstrated that they're able to recognize early signs and symptoms and supported by their supervisors and are provided the latitude to manage their work rate and their fluid intake. So this level of heat stress management cannot be followed without proper heat stress awareness and prevention training. So again, you need to be trained to follow the supported self-management. That's basically when people listen to their body and they're able to, manage heat stress on their own. This is the ideal situation. You would then have the Humidex plan, or the WBGT estimate-based heat response plan. So the Humidex-based heat response plan is a simplified version of the ACGIH TLV, and it's based on direct measurements of temperature and relative humidity. And the measurements are converted to Humidex or WBGT, then prescribing preventative action. So this is designed for workplaces without process heat or humidity sources and regular work clothing, and usually a moderate workload as well. Then you have the screening TLV, which is basically following the ACGIH directly. So using the official screening WBGT measurement, so you would need the proper equipment. So you would need a wet bulb globe thermometer for this. It's for a bit more complex and unusual exposures. There's also the option to do the TLV analysis method, which is a little more complex as well. But definitely look at the TLV documentation to follow this. And you would need a WBGT meter to do these methods. And then finally, we have the TLV for physiological monitoring. This is really for complex cases, and you'd have to follow the ACGIH criteria. It can also be used for self-monitoring, so using smartwatches or other apps can be useful, but they are an unofficial approach, and you got to caution with their accuracy and validity. So we'll go through a little bit of everything here. So supported self-management, really there's training elements that you would need to have. So you'd have to have the So exposed worker training elements. So this is kind of the elements that you're looking for a training program. You want to make sure that it's in a language and a learning pattern that's adapted to the workers and that they'll understand and it's clear. They need to know what the signs and symptoms of heat stress is. And it's good to have them kind of relate their own experiences to heat stress, right? Most people have been exposed to heat stress in some way or form in their lifetime. They may not even know it. So by telling them what it is and what kind of experiences they may have had from working in the heat, it kind of makes them recognize what's going on. And then you have to show them what to do in cases of signs and symptoms. So whether it's first aid responses, just listen to your body, how much to drink, when to take a break, and when to drink, right? And the logistics behind it. So again, are they getting enough fluid supply? Do they know where this fluid supply is? Is it supplied by their employer? Do they have to bring it themselves? Those are all questions to ask. How do they monitor hydration? Do they know how? Just using a urine chart is a good thing. Do they wait for the thirst sensation, or do they drink beforehand? Are they having muscle cramps? How much fluid are they supposed to take? When should they drink electrolytes? They need to know that alcohol and caffeine actually dehydrates the body. So taking notes of all of this, and also knowing that if you're dripping in sweat, you got to know how to respond to that. Usually when you're dripping in sweat, you're definitely going under heat stress, and this is the time. Okay, well, let's take a break. Let's drink some water and a little bit of rest, and then keep going after that. Watching out for coworkers, so having a buddy system is another thing, and having supervisors looking out for their teammates. What's the role of supervisor? Reviewing your SOP if there is one. Looking at videos, posters, info cards if you have them available. We do have an SOP as part of the heat stress toolkit that you can just take. Everything is in there that you can follow. You can change it if you want to, but if you don't have one and you need one, we have a standard of practice ready to go for anyone who needs one. Demonstration of training. This is an important thing. So after your training is done, it's important to go ask the workers while they're on site to see, just ask them a question. What would you do if your worker collapsed here? What would you do if you're just feeling tired or feeling stress, like you're feeling that heat stress? What would you do, right? They should be able to answer those questions pretty easily. And you ask them while they're working in the environment. And then they need to know their health and safety rights and the internal procedures to exercise those rights. And the critical role of supervisors. So the supervisor needs to know the heat stress management plan as well. It's not only for employers or employees. The supervisor needs to know because they're the direct line of communication most of the time, and often they're the ones watching over their employees. So they need to know what to do in these cases as well. So these are experts from the general controls directly from ACGIH. So the first thing is, training, providing verbal and written instruction for pre-job and annual training programs with information about heat stress and strain, heat disorders, mitigation plan, and emergency response plan in a language format that is understood by workers and supervisors. So if you look at Table 5 of the ACGIH, there are the elements of the heat stress management program. And this is from our calculator. So we evaluate your heat stress training program right in the calculator, and we'll go through that at the end of this presentation. But we'll evaluate your outcomes and delivery as inadequate, minimal, sufficient, or excellent going through it. So just to be minimal, you have to tick off these 6 training outcomes to be in a minimal stage. So, can you explain what heat rash is and how to treat it? Do you know the symptoms of heat syncope? Be aware of the cause of muscle cramps and know what to drink to counter the symptoms. Can you recognize the symptoms of heat exhaustion? Understand the dangers of heat stroke and need to watch for others, and understand that heat stroke is a life or death medical emergency. If you know those 6 and you could check them off, then you have a minimal heat stress management program or training, I should say. But obviously you would try and get to excellent if you can. So again, if you're looking at the supportive self-management, low-tech tools is something like this, like hydration urine charts, where it tells you that you're good or you're dehydrated or very dehydrated. And then there's other infographics that we have that you can just post on your bulletin boards or in washrooms and things like that to remind people of the signs and symptoms of heat stress. So the Humidex base heat response plan. So you'll notice that we removed Humidex 2 in the response plan. In the old plan, it had a Humidex 2, which was for acclimatized workers. The reason we removed Humidex 2 is because most employers were only using that as their measure, even though their workers were not acclimatized. So there is an acclimatization argument here. Acclimatization requires physical activity under heat stress like those anticipated for the work for at least 2 hours for 5 of the last 7 days for a worker to be acclimatized for the purpose of TLV. And acclimatization declines when activity under heat stress conditions are discontinued. And a noticeable loss occurs after 4 days and may be completely lost in 3 weeks. So a person may not be fully acclimatized to sudden or episodic higher level of heat stress. So this means that you may be exposed to 26 degrees Celsius or a Humidex, we'll say, of 30, which is a little bit under heat stress, but not extreme heat stress, for 5 days of the 7, or 5 of the last 7 days. But then you have, 2 days that are extreme heat, and you have a Humidex of 42, 43. Well, you're not acclimatized to that heat, so you really got to watch your workers for that. So you'd almost have to re-acclimatize for that. You might have some of the adaptations to heat, but not enough to be acclimatized to the higher levels of heat. So that's an important thing to remember as well. So that's one of the reasons we took out Humidex 2, is because it was being misused. So employers just assume that everyone was acclimatized, so we removed that option. If heat stress conditions allow for acclimatization, the workplace should follow the official TLB using the WBGT. So determining acclimatization, so this was for summer of 2023. So if you look at the summer, this would be for outdoor workers. So we have our acclimatization TLB threshold, which is the dotted red line. And you look at how much time was spent above that threshold where you can actually be acclimatized, which is 27.5 in WBGT. So you only had 3 days in July, and then you had 1 day at the end of July. So you almost had a 3-week period there. Well, yeah, basically a 3-week period where there wasn't any heat stress above the acclimatized threshold. So that person lost all of their adaptations before being exposed to heat again. And then again, at the end of the summer, in September, we had another 3 days. And looking at, and this is, there's no acclimatization even with solar radiation and wind velocity incorporated into WBGT. So this is looking at both or all 3 temperatures, right? So you got your radiation, you got your dry bulb with wind velocity, and your natural wet bulb. So and then again, if you're looking at 2024, basically the same thing. In June, we had 3 days, and then we had a full month, even more than that, of nothing above the acclimatized threshold. And then we had 2 days in August, and then another day at the end of August, and that was it. So really, outdoor workers, it's impossible to become acclimatized in Ontario. And this is also the most southern weather station. So we're looking at the Lincoln weather station. It's not the most southern. This is near London, I'm pretty sure. But still more southern than most places in Ontario. So the Humidex heat response plan. So this is kind of what you have here. So you have 5 steps, and we're going to go through these individually, and then you would apply that to your response plan with an adjusted Humidex. The reason it's adjusted is because you have to adjust for clothing and adjust for radiant heat. You're not only taking the measurement of the workplace. So first step is training. We talked about a lot about that already. So it's probably the most crucial element of the plan. Obviously, the knowledge that's gained can be used to save a life, and also it can be used to move towards the supported self-management. So the Humidex plan by itself cannot guarantee that workers will not be affected by heat stress. So it's essential that workers know and recognize the early signs and symptoms. And again, taking regular breaks, fluid intake, in response to any early symptoms. So ideally, what we're trying to do is have the workers listen to their body. So that's where we're trying to get to. Okay, next you would want to select a measurement location. So a good location is within 10 meters of the exposure worker. So if you're looking at the workplace key stress zones, you want to make sure that you have a hygrometer or your WBGT meter within 10 meters of the exposed workers. And you want to obviously identify a zone where measurements can be taken. And based on your action, if you want to base your actions on a single reading, then you got to select the highest heat stress zone. So wherever the highest heat is, that's where you want to take the measurement, and you would apply that to the entire workforce in that area anyway. And this is based on workplace measurements and not weather station or media reports, right? So for outdoor workers, you can use weather station, but it's not ideal. The best thing to do is to take something at the source itself. If you don't have access to it, so for workers, sometimes you don't have it, the employers aren't providing thermometers or the hygrometers that you need. And just to make, to be self-aware, you can use weather station network for yourself. But again, you got to think of the other heat that's around. You might have some process heat, from tractors or things like that if you're outdoors, or furnaces if you're indoors. So obviously for indoor, you can't use a weather station, but for outdoor, there's some situations where you may be able to. But again, the best thing is to measure at the source within 10 meters with a hygrometer. So then you would measure the workplace humidity or Humidex. So using a thermal hygrometer, so they're pretty cheap. They're $10 to $50 at hardware stores. They're pretty accurate. Simple way to measure the temperature and relative humidity in your workplace. Once you have the temperature and relative humidity, you would use a table to have your corresponding Humidex value and the appropriate heat stress prevention response. But you need to remember you need to adjust for clothing and radiant heat. And measurements should be recorded at least hourly if Humidex reaches 30 degrees Humidex. And anything more than that, you should be recording a time-weighted average on the hourly. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So measuring temperature and relative humidity. So we have these older Dretton wet bulb temperatures, then you would apply it, or a sling psychrometer, you would apply it to this table here. But like I was mentioning, you can just purchase a thermal hygrometer. They're pretty accurate. They're usually within 0.5 degrees Celsius and 0.5% as well for Humidex or for relative humidity. So they're fairly accurate and much easier to use. And they're cheaper than these other two pieces of equipment as well now. So it's a win-win. So once you have your number, you would place it in this table. This is actually this is the Humidex table. We have a WBGT table as well. So if you're taking measurement with a wet bulb glow thermometer, but you want to read, you want to know what the risk is with the WBGT table, Thomas Bernard actually converted Humidex into WBGT. So that's another thing. You could take temperature and relative humidity and get an estimated WBGT. So I'll just try an example using Humidex. So we have 30 degrees Celsius in the workplace. So what would the Humidex be? You don't know, right? You still need the relative humidity. So if you have a relative humidity of 50%, now what's the Humidex? Oh, now we place that at 50. We get a Humidex of 36 here. But then we need to adjust for clothing, right? So evaporating the sweat is primary way the body gets rid of excess heat buildup. So the best clothing is the kind that makes it easiest for sweat to evaporate. So the Humidex plan assumes regular summer clothes. So that's a long sleeve t-shirt or long sleeve shirt, long pants, underwear, socks, and shoes. So that's regular summer clothes. So for workers who wear cotton overalls on top of the regular clothes, so you would have to add 5 to 6 degrees Humidex to the workplace Humidex measurement. And then for different types of clothing configurations, there's estimates for the clothing adjustments, comparing them to cotton coveralls. So if they're wearing gloves, hard hat, apron, protective sleeves, you might want to add a little bit. It'd be less than the overalls, but you would have to estimate that yourself. It'd be 1 to 2 degrees Humidex, depending on what they're wearing and what the evaporative resistance is to that clothing as well. So if clothing does not allow for sweat evaporation, so something like encapsulated suits, heat stress should be managed by monitoring vital signs, which would be physiological monitoring. So here we have the official ECGIH clothing adjustment values. So if you look at just regular work clothes, you have an increase. Well, you don't have an increase; it's 0, and the 0 Humidex. If you're wearing short sleeves and pants, then like a short sleeve shirt with pants, you would have a -1 in your WBGT and a -2 in your Humidex, and then so forth. If you're wearing polypropylene coveralls, you're +1 Humidex, and so on. So if you look at vapor barrier coveralls with a hood, you're looking at +11 WBGT and +22 Humidex. So again, if you're in this situation, you want to be using physiological monitoring for that. But what if you're required to wear leather gloves, hard hat, an apron, earmuffs? None of that is in this form. So OHCOW found an article that looked at different areas. Well, basically the amount of sweat coming from different areas of your body and relative to 100%, right? So where is 100% of your sweat coming from? So they measured the head, the arms, the body, the core, the legs, everything. So from that, we were able to derive clothing adjustment values for different pieces of equipment or different pieces of PPE. So we have the different numbers here. They had 0.2 to 0.6, even 3 to the Humidex. And so if we added all of these together, so impervious gloves, apron, hard hat, earmuffs, so we have an estimate of about +2 in a Humidex. So what's the alternative is guessing. So this is a little bit more accurate than just saying, okay, well, I have all of this stuff, let's add 2, or let's add 3, or let's add 1, which is what it used to be. So now we actually have numbers to back that up. So adjusting for radiant heat as well. So because you're measuring thermal hygrometers, it does not measure radiant heat. So we need to adjust for this factor. So for outdoor work in direct sunlight between the hours of 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., you want to add 3 to 4 degrees Humidex. And you want to prorate that according to cloud cover. So if it's wide open direct sunlight, it's 3 to 4. If there's more cloud coverage, you might just do 2 to 3. And if it's fully like full cloud coverage, then you might not add anything. For indoor radiant heat exposure, you'd use common sense or judge whether it's the same as direct sunlight or more or less, and you'd estimate the appropriate proportion to the 3 to 4 degree unit adjustment factor. So if you're next to a furnace and you feel that it's a much warmer than being in direct sunlight, or 1.5 times warmer or 2 times warmer, you would estimate that yourself. If it's 2 times, you'd say, okay, well, let's add 4 or 8 degrees to this Humidex. If it's 1.5, you'd say, okay, 6, just things like that. So try an example of that as well. So it's 30 degrees in workplace, 50% relative humidity, have a Humidex of 36. So where they're working, so if we add the 2 from wearing gloves, apron, hard hats, earmuffs, now you're at 38, right? Humidex. But what about the outdoor sunshine? So what's the adjusted Humidex with the outdoor sunshine? So you would add 3 or 4, right, to the Humidex. So now let's say we add 3, we're at 41. So we just went through 3 different categories there based on just adjusting for clothing and adjusting for radiant heat. So that's why it's important to not just take the measurement that you're reading. You have to really adjust for what your workers are wearing, because the response changes significantly there. So what about taking breaks? If they're taking breaks indoors in a cafeteria, they have a temperature of 25 degrees Celsius with a relative humidity of 60. So that's a humidex of 30 in the cafeteria. So if they're taking hourly breaks, so we need to look at time weighted average, and that's what I was talking about earlier. It's the TLV is based on time weighted average, so it's best to do that for every measurement, whether it's a humidex or the WBGT. And the heat stress TLV looks at hourly time weighted average, not 8-hour time weighted average like most other occupational exposure levels. So you need to take that average into account. So you're measuring over the hour. So what are you getting? So this is just calculating, not really, we just kind of added these for the purpose of making it quicker. So we have 6 measurements every 10 minutes. So we have 36, 37, 35, 36, and 34, and 38. So those are the measurements that you're getting at the location of heat stress. So you have a humidex of 36 here over the hour. But what if we're taking 20-minute break in the cafeteria? So now you have your humidex of 30, and your workstation humidex is 36. So you got to take that time weighted average, right? So you're going to say, okay, well, 20 out of the 60 minutes times 30 humidex, and then 40 out of 60 minutes times 36. And that'll give you a humidex of 34. So now we still got to add the adjustments for clothing and for working outdoors in direct sunlight. So you'd add the 2 for clothing, add the 3 for direct sunlight, and you end up with a humidex of 39 with your breaks. So without the breaks, we're getting a humidex of 41 adjusted. With the breaks, we're getting a humidex of 39 for an adjusted humidex. So now we're back into the lower response, right? So just things to consider, and it's important to look at all of the factors when measuring heat stress, that you can fall into different responses based on your adjustments. So important to look at the adjustments. This is the WBGT estimate table. So based on your temperature and relative humidity, Thomas Bernard had a calculation that will give you the effective WBGT estimate. And then if you're working direct sunlight, you would add 2.2 degrees Celsius of WBGT to the estimated table. So here we have both units. So based on the response, so you can see that the WBGT, or the effective WBGT, is quite a bit lower than the humidex. So that's something you need to remember. WBGT is often lower than even the outdoor temperature. So you might be reading a WBGT meter and say, oh, it's not that hot. It's only 27 degrees. Whereas your regular thermometer or your hygrometer will say it's 33 degrees out. And then your humidex is actually 40, or 42. So it's important to realize that a high WBGT is, basically anything over 27, you're in the heat stress zone. So, whereas it's anything over 20 or 39 in humidex. There's a big difference there. So the ACGIH method, so this is moving on to the screening criteria, requires measurement of the WBGT. So you would need the machine and the knowledge and training on how to use it. You'd obviously need to follow the clothing adjustment considerations, which is why it's called an effective WBGT. You would assign the metabolic workload demand. So this is, with the humidex-based response plan, it's based on a moderate workload. Whereas here, if you're using a heavy or very heavy workload, you would use the ACGIH method. You can determine acclimatization, whether the workers are acclimatized or not. Determine unadjusted work rest regime patterns. So, whether they're working for 15 minutes every hour, or half an hour or 30 minutes every hour. And then you would use table 3 to determine the need for any types of controls. Oh, sorry. And it's based on a 1 hour time weighted average, like I mentioned earlier. So the metabolic categories. So here we have the 3 different ones. Well, we have low, which is below 235 watts. Moderate would be, 235 to 360. The average is 300. Heavy is, 415. Very heavy is 520. But the thing you got to take into account is the weight of the individual. So if all of this was estimated, or was, all of this was estimated on a body weight ratio of 70 kilograms or 154 pounds. So this was done in the 1960s using soldiers, which are, at the time were smaller and very fit people. So, 154 pounds is probably not the norm for males. So you got to adjust for the metabolic rate. So you take a ratio of that 154 pounds. So if someone weighs 200 pounds, you would divide that by 154 pounds and use that ratio to calculate your wattage. So someone who is 154 pounds might be in the moderate, but someone who's 200 pounds might be in the heavy or even very heavy category based on metabolic work. So we're all different. So it's something to consider. There's also the biological sex difference issue. So female sex at birth will often go through an ovulation period. And during that period, your body temperature will reach up to 38 degrees Celsius. So they might be more susceptible to heat stress at that time. Women who are pregnant and women going through menopause, same thing with the hormonal changes. Often your body is heating up where you're reaching that 38 degrees Celsius without activity. So then we have the TLV physiological monitoring. So again, there's some good and some bad with this, right? So there's concerns about collection and confidentiality of medical information. So if you are going to follow the TLV, you would need to have consent forms. You would need to have proper medical management of data. So it'd have to be locked up so that nobody can see it. There's a few legalities around that you'd have to do and follow. It can be used for self-calibration. So this is more for, other tools like Fitbits and watches that measure heart rate. And then, you can measure heart rate based on, you can measure heat stress based on your heart rate. So if you see that you have a sustained heart rate of 120 beats per minute, you know that you're under heat stress. If you're just, sitting there in the heat, often that's what happens. Or right after activity, your heart rate isn't coming back down below 120 beats per minute after a minute rest. So these are all things, and if you're noticing that with your watch, then you can kind of self-calibrate yourself, and it can really evolve into supported self-management because you kind of, just look at your watch. Holy geez, my heartbeat is super high right now. I know I'm under heat stress. I'm going to take a break, right? Things like that. But again, you need to remember that reliability and validity of self-monitoring technology isn't always the best. There's some that are better than others, and you can refer to the physiological monitoring guide for some of that information. So our heat stress calculator, we'll go through this quickly. How much time do I have left here? So let's go through the heat stress calculator. We'll show you that. So this is a new calculator, and it goes through all the assumptions to have a good heat stress program. So there's 6 assumptions. So it'll ask you what type of data you've collected. So we'll just go through this. So let's say we took, you can do both. So you can do detailed WBGT, or you can do temperature and relative humidity. Do temperature and relative humidity, it'll ask you, okay, well, what do you want, the Humidex or the WBGT estimate? So we'll do the Humidex. And then it'll ask you, so that this is the second, or yeah, the second assumption, or the first assumption, where the measurement location, was the measurement taken within 10 meters? So we'll say yes to this as an example. And what was the temperature related? Let's say 28 degrees Celsius, relative humidity of 60%. So the other assumption is your training and knowledge. So you have to confirm your training and knowledge prior to moving forward. So this will take you to that sheet that I showed you earlier. And in order to have an adequate training, you need to be trained within the last year for a minimum of 10 to 30 minutes. And in person is ideal. Online interactive is okay, and video, well, it's not the greatest. So let's just go with video for now, because a lot of people tend to do that. And I can explain that, you know, I know what a heat rash is, I know what heat syncope is, I know what heat stroke is, I know that it can cause life or death, and I can recognize heat exhaustion system symptoms. So let's just say that that's all that we know. So it'll bring you here and say, okay, well, based on the information you provided, your training delivery program is rated as inadequate because you're only doing video, and your training outcomes are rated as minimal. So let's change that just for an example here. Okay, well, let's go. It was online interactive, and I did a workstation follow-up. It was within the last year. It was a 30 to 60 minute training, and I know who to contact. I know the limits of my body. I understand how heart rate can be monitored. I know how much water to drink. I can check for hydration status. I know where to get water when I need it. I understand I need to drink more than thirst alone. I should be drinking every 20 minutes. I'm aware of emergency procedures. You know, understand that your body generates heat during activity. And I realize that personal cooling options are available, and I know the physical health conditions pose a risk factor for heat stress. So if I know all of these, well, now I have both of them are excellent. So my training delivery is excellent, and my outcomes are excellent. So then it would go, before you even get your number for Humidex, you know, where are your workers working? Are they indoors? Are they outdoors? Let's say outdoors in the shade. And then the other assumption is your clothing. So are they wearing typical work clothing? Is yes, great. If not, you can't move forward until you select your PPE. So if yes, you can go select your PPE and they're just wearing regular work clothes. You can do that. Or you can hit yes, but they're also wearing regular work clothes, and they're wearing an apron, they're wearing N95 respirator, we'll say, because they're grinding, hard hat, and a face shield. Okay, so now really it's they're wearing regular work clothes, but there's additional PPE there. And is there any radiant heat or moisture other than the sun? So if we say yes, typically it'll say, well, you should probably do the ACJ HTLV. But we could say yes here. There is a radiant demand for moisture, so it'll add it to the WBGT, or to the Humidex. So now we click calculate. All your assumptions are in, and it'll give you your adjusted Humidex. So you have your Humidex 35 plus your 1.4 clothing PPE. So you have an adjusted Humidex 36, but it said that we had radiant heat. So here it should say something. Yeah, so there are additional exposures to radiant heat and moisture sources, and therefore this calculation may not fully include the full effect of these exposures. Consider using the detailed WBGT method instead. Okay, so that means that we would have to go back and do the detailed WBGT. So let's go back here. Oh, if we do another one here, we'll do the detailed WBGT, and we'll show you the difference. So do I have a wet bulb growth thermometer? Yes, I do. Okay. If I don't, then it'll say you can't do that. You have to go back to the estimate method. So yes, I have one. My, we'll say it's 20, that's high. So we'll say it's 27 WBGT, which is pretty high. And I confirm my training and knowledge. I'll say within the last year in person, and I can do these and like 3 others just to see. You'll see that it's okay, sufficient, right? You have a sufficient training program and your training outcomes are sufficient. And then you're working outdoors in the shade, we'll say. PPE, say work clothes, same thing, impervious apron, N95, face shield, hard hat. Submit that. And yes, there is. So now you can specify, what are you exposed to? They will say that, so we're grinding near let's say hot pavement. And it's about 100 to 200 degrees, and I'm 1 to 3 meters away. It's a presence of insulate, somewhat, not really. Proportion exposed time per hour. So we'll say more than 20 minutes per hour that you're next to. So now it'll give you your assumptions here again. Oh, and I'm doing a heavy workload because I'm constantly grinding. And how many workers? So again, so adjusting for weight, right? So let's say we're just doing the single worker, say 195 pounds or 190 pounds. And then are they female sex at birth? No. It's a male doing the job. Okay. So then it'll tell you. So if you say female sex at birth, it'll give you another warning once you calculate that based on everything that we spoke about earlier. So now you have your WBGT 27, your work, your clothing in WBGT at 0.7 extra, and effective WBGT would be 27.7 degrees. And then you would have your warnings here for each one, right? So your training is sufficient, your assumptions are good, your typical clothing is there, and this is what your measurement would be. So, and again, here would be looking at the metabolic rate issue as well. So it just tells you that, it took that into account. So that is what our calculator looks like. Let's go back here. What am I looking for here? Where's my PowerPoint? I guess it got out of it. So anyways, so this is kind of what we end up with here. So it provides, so it checks all your 6 assumptions, which we talked about. And only after responding to 6 assumptions, you proceed to temperature, relative humidity. So you end up with your summary here. We also have the SOP, like I spoke about. So if you don't have a heat stress management plan, you can contact myself or John Audick, and we can give you this SOP. There's one as part of the toolkit online, so you can also get it there. So yeah, if there's any questions about the toolkit, you can ask them now, or you can email myself. My email is there, or John. And yeah, that's basically it. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Andre. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think I went a little bit over time. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. There's a number of questions, but I'll try to limit them. Some of them I believe are likely beyond the scope of your presentation and what you were trying to relay here. Does the tool take into account the level of work intensity in watts?
Well, you would have to calculate that, but yes, it does. Like the tool is like the calculator. That's why when you look at the calculator, you can check, low, moderate, heavy, especially if you have to go in the detailed TLV for that though. If you're only doing the Humidex plan, it's based on moderate activity and that's it. So if you are working with heavy workloads or very heavy workloads. And you can calculate that in watts based on, you know, what kind of work you're doing. You'd have to look at, you know, there's research papers out there, but if, let's go back to right here. See, so this is, you know, moderate workload is sustained moderate hand arm work, moderate arm leg work, moderate arm trunk work, or light pushing and pulling, normal walking. Heavy workloads instead, it'd be more intense, carrying, shoveling, manual sawing, pushing, pulling heavy objects, walking at a fast pace. Then very heavy is very intense activity, so the fast to maximum pace. And then you would, you know, calculate the metabolic rate based on the individual.
Okay. Yeah, there's a number of questions on hydration and electrolytes and stuff, but I believe those are probably beyond this. But other than urine color, what are there other indicators that you can use for hydration levels for workers?
Well, you can see if they're getting sluggish and things like that. Most of the time, they're starting to become dehydrated. Again, a lot of that is self-management, right? Knowing your hydration levels and things like that. Training is huge. Making sure that they know that and posting you know, the urine charts and things like that would be good. Because you're not going to know whether they're dehydrated or not until they start, you know, having symptoms. And those are the ones that you would see, right? Whether they're having heat rashes or muscle cramps or even just, you know, fainting or just general tiredness.
Okay. All right, that's good. Thank you.